Did Jesus break Sabbath laws? Well, in Mark chapter 2, 23 through chapter 3, verse 6, Jesus is questioned by the Jewish religious leaders about just that. Now, if you're not Jewish or you haven't read the Hebrew Bible, the Sabbath, the seventh day of the week, was very holy. It's so much bigger than what Christians often make it. And since we're trying to make an informed decision about Jesus, we really need understanding. So, did Jesus break Sabbath laws, or did those Jewish religious leaders make a mountain out of a molehill? Well, let's read and then let's investigate. Okay, let's start by reading Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through chapter 3, verse 6. So one Sabbath, he, that is Jesus, was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him?" And he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. So Jesus is being questioned about whether he's breaking the law on the Sabbath. So did Jesus break the law, or were these Pharisees, these Jewish religious leaders, making much to do about nothing? Well, I have to say initially, no. The Pharisees weren't wrong. The Sabbath is such a huge deal to our Jewish friends. It has been for centuries. It still is today. Now, I could just tell you that it's a really big deal, but I want you to fully appreciate, or at least appreciate as best you can, the context, the biblical context in which our Jewish friends recognize the Sabbath as being so sacred and so holy, and why these religious leaders would have had such a hard time with Jesus doing things that, at least on the face of it, they shouldn't be doing on the Sabbath. So I'm going to read through a couple scriptures, and you may need to come back, mark these, and read through them later. But it really will help you understand the tension, because there's a lot of tension in the two stories that I just read. So when it comes to understanding the significance of the Sabbath, the first comes in the very beginning, like in the second chapter of the Bible. God has created all things in Genesis chapter 1. And then in Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, it says this: "Thus the heavens and earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done." So we see right up front, God is modeling this concept of 6 periods of work and 1 period of rest. 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. The Sabbath day, from the beginning of the creation of time, was set apart and made holy. And much later into the story of God's people, that is Israel, as God is bringing them up out of slavery in Egypt and into the wilderness to there give them their laws and commands and form them into a great nation. Right near the beginning, God tested Israel about the seventh day. He instructed them with this bread he was giving them. He was giving them manna, bread from heaven. And each day on the ground there would be this seed-like bread. In fact, the Israelites looked at it and they're like, what is this? And that's how it got its name, manna. Well, God said, for 6 days you can go out and collect that manna, but only collect enough for each day. It's going to be there tomorrow. You don't have to worry about it. Don't collect too much, just enough for that day. On the 6th day, I want you to collect a double portion though. I want you to collect enough for the 6th day and for the 7th day, because on the 7th day, I don't want you to do anything. Well, there was maybe some trust issues. I mean, they're just developing really their relationship with God again. And some of the Israelites went out on the 7th day to collect bread, and there was none. They were supposed to collect enough on the 6th day, remember? Well, God was testing them, and in Exodus chapter 16, verses 28 through 30, the Lord says to Moses, the leader of the people, he says, how long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the 7th day. No one is to go out. So the people rested on the 7th day, right? So God models it in the beginning, and then he institutes it as a test as he's forming this nation. It's really, really important. Well, eventually, the Sabbath became the sign of the covenant between God and his people. He gives them the 10 commandments. He gives them the law. He says, out of all of the peoples of the earth, you're going to be my treasured possession, a holy nation, a kingdom of priests to the rest of the people. And I'm giving you these laws and these instructions so that the other nations can see that you are blessed. And they will want to understand why you are blessed. And you will say, you know, we are blessed by the Lord, Yahweh, the creator of all things. And in that way, it will draw all people to God himself. So God makes this covenant with the people. And in Exodus 20, part of those commandments is in verse 8. It says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall do no work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that's in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So what started as God modeling it, then became God using it to instruct the Israelites to rely on him. And then it became actually part of the law. It's like part of the 10 commandments. So it's a really big deal. Well, it gets even bigger than that. And I know this is a lot to go through, but I think it's so important that you understand this context of Jesus being criticized for doing what he did on the Sabbath. God reminds the Israelites of how important practicing the Sabbath is. In Exodus 31, then the Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbaths. This will be a sign between me and you for the generations to come, so you may know that I am the Lord who makes you holy. I am the Lord who makes you holy. This Sabbath, this resting on the 7th day, you, your whole family, your animals, everyone who works for you, don't work on the 7th day. It's holy. It's going to be a sign of our covenant. It's like a wedding ring, really is what it is. It's a symbol. Like, I mean, think about it. If you're one of these neighboring, nations, and you encounter a group of people who don't work on the 7th day, or maybe you work for them, and they're not working on the 7th day, and then you have a day off. They're so confused. Why are we not working today? What's so different about this? That is an opportunity to introduce, hey, we're in a covenant with God. This was such a big deal. Well, there were consequences to when the Israelites didn't practice the Sabbath. And let me just read one more scripture so you can kind of, again, get more context for why this is so important. This one comes from Numbers chapter 15, verses 32 through 36. While the Israelites were in the wilderness, a man was found gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Those who found him gathering wood brought him to Moses and Aaron and the whole assembly, and they kept him in custody because it wasn't clear what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, "The man must die. The whole assembly must stone him outside the camp." So the assembly took him outside the camp and stoned him to death, as the Lord commanded Moses. So now I hope you can see just how serious God was about keeping the Sabbath, and why the Pharisees might have some questions when they see someone, especially a teacher like Jesus, doing things or instructing things, or having the presence of working on the Sabbath day, right? You might say, and I know that's a complicated story, like, why did that man have to be put to death? Well, remember, this wasn't just God modeling it. This wasn't just God testing. This had become part of the covenant. This had been reminded multiple times. And now this man appears to be disregarding, maybe even just disrespecting Yahweh, the creator of heaven and earth, altogether. Like, it's not that big a deal. I'm just picking up some firewood, right? I'm just trying to get ahead. And God's like, no, this kind of disrespect will be contagious throughout the camp. So early on, this man was stoned outside the camp and served as a grave warning for the generation to come. The Sabbath is a very big deal to God. It's part of this covenant between them. So again, I think the Pharisees are asking a very legitimate question. Why is Jesus and his disciples eating and picking heads of grain and eating it on the Sabbath? So Jesus ends up explaining it with a story. And I want to come back to what I read earlier, right? The Pharisees in verse 24 were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him?" And he points to a story about David, who later became one of the first kings of Israel. But even before he became king, he had been anointed by a prophet of God that he would one day become king, because the current king, King Saul, was evil, and he was trying to chase after David and his men and put them to death. So there's a story in the Hebrew Bible in the book of Samuel, or what we call 1 Samuel, chapter 21, verses 1 through 9. Okay, 1 Samuel 21, 1 through 9. You can go read the story later. I'm not going to read the full thing now because it deserves enough attention of its own. But Jesus summarized the story, right? Jesus summarized the story, and he says, don't you know the story how David entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. Right? Haven't you read that story? That's how he's summarizing the story. And we might say, okay, what do you mean by that? Was David right in doing that? Was he right in going into the house of God and eating this bread of the presence, right? I mean, Jesus actually says it wasn't lawful. No, it was not lawful for him to do that. Only the priests could eat that. Let me just read where it says in Exodus, okay? Exodus 29, verses 32 through 33. God is giving instructions about this bread of the presence along with some other symbols. At the entrance to the tent of meeting, Aaron and his sons are to eat the meat of the ram and the bread that is in the basket. That is this bread of the presence. They are to eat these offerings by which atonement was made for their ordination and consecration. But no one else may eat them because they are sacred, right? Now, let me just go off on a little tangent here. I want you to note the similarities of how Jesus is describing what David did. Note the similarities of what he did, along with the similarities of what Adam and Eve did in Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. Okay? Jesus says that David went into the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which he was not supposed to, and he gave some to his companions. It compares very well and even creates tension when in Genesis 3, Eve eats from the tree that she was not supposed to eat from and gives some to her companions. I mean, this sentence structure is perfectly parallel, which should create tension. It's creating tension because there is something of which someone is not supposed to eat, and they not only eat it themselves, but they give it to others, right? So this is creating tension. I mean, and Jesus says that it was not lawful for him to do that, right? So Jesus says, no, it's not lawful, but also he implies yes, that it was okay. Yes, there was an exception. And why would that be? Well, Jesus is explaining, if you know that story, that David, who was God's anointed, was personally suffering and in need only because King Saul was unjustly trying to kill David and his men. So there was an exception to the law about the bread of the presence. The exception to the law about the bread of the presence of David eating that actually reveals the true purpose of the law. Okay? I hope I haven't lost you here. But the purpose of the bread of the presence was for the priests only to eat of this bread. And that this bread served as symbols, so it served alongside some other symbols, right? That God is holy, all life flows from him, and as humans, there is a right way. We need to approach God in a certain way. And we cannot approach God in our sin. But God will forgive our sin if we make sacrifices to him about our sin, if we confess our sin to him and submit. He will provide life to us because he is the bread of life. Now, again, I know this seems all really confusing, but I want you to understand, okay? Our main question is, did Jesus break Sabbath laws? And Jesus is using this story of David going in and eating something he wasn't supposed to and giving some to his companions. He uses that story and how there is an exception to the law there to show the true purpose of the law. And in this case, he's showing the true purpose of the Sabbath, right? In Mark 2, verses 27, he says, listen, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man. It was intended to be a gift. God gave the people the Sabbath. So it's better, Jesus is saying, it's better to alleviate human suffering than to keep the letter of the law. Let me say that again because this is so big. It is better to alleviate human suffering than to keep the letter of the law. Let me give a trivial example here, right? Okay, I have kids. They're not too far. It's kind of crazy. Keeps me up at night, not too far from driving. At some point, we'll have a curfew for them, right? Because it's just wise to give your kids, as they're growing up, a curfew. But imagine this being like a teenager breaking an 11 p.m. curfew in order to help a friend whose car broke down. That's what this is like. The letter of the law is be home by 11 p.m. or else. The spirit of the law is actually, hey, I want you home by 11 because anything that happens after that is probably not good, and I actually want to protect you from all of that. But if your child says, hey, I'm sorry, I didn't make it home by the 11 p.m. curfew because a friend of mine's car broke down and I went to get them to return them, that is still operating within the spirit of the law, the spirit of the curfew, right? So Jesus is saying, in the same way, my disciples are in need. Now, I wonder if the Pharisees were thinking, yeah, I get that about David, but you're not David, okay? But before they could object, Jesus addressed their concern, right? In Mark 2, verses 28, Jesus says this, so the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, right? I, as the Son of Man, referring to the prophecies about one who is like a son of man to come and receive divine authority from God. Go check it out in Daniel chapter 7. Well, the Pharisees didn't respond to this. They didn't respond to Jesus referring to himself as the Son of Man or as him having authority over the Sabbath. I don't think they really got it yet, but they're about to, right? Instead, what strikes me is what the Pharisees didn't do, okay? They don't look out and see Jesus and his disciples plucking grain from the heads of the grain as they're going along. They don't say, oh Jesus, wait, hey, y'all don't need to do that. We've got extra bread. We've got more than enough bread here. That's what a religious leader should be doing. If they see someone who they think isn't following the law, they should instead try to help them. Instead, the Pharisees were notorious for weighing others down in order to keep themselves high in practicing the letter of the law. So Jesus tried to explain it another way, and that's what the second story is about the man who has this withered hand that Jesus heals on the Sabbath to make a point. I mean, he's healing this man with the withered hand to make a point, and he was angry that the Pharisees weren't getting it. Right? That they would willingly allow human suffering when healing is available. In order to fulfill the letter of the law, they would willingly allow human suffering when healing was available. Healing. That's what the Sabbath is about. That's what the bread of the presence was about. It's about healing. It's about renewal and restoration. But the Pharisees' their identities were based in their performance in keeping the letter of the law and ensuring that everybody else kept the letter of the law. And in so doing, they missed a fundamental aspect of holiness. I mean, the Lord says it himself. The Sabbath doesn't make you holy. The Sabbath, as important as it is, the Sabbath doesn't make you holy. The Lord does. You keep the Sabbath because you already are holy. You have been set apart, and you have been set apart to be godly. And as you have been set apart to be godly, you should keep the Sabbath because you have been set apart. So the spirit of the Sabbath really is about trusting that God will provide. It's about new creation. It's about abundance. It's about renewal. It's about shalom. Perfect peace. Life as God intended it. Sadly, we see how evil the thinking was of the Pharisees in chapter 3, verse 6. The Pharisees, after hearing all this, the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. So we went through all of that, and I want to just clearly respond to the question that we raised in the beginning. Did Jesus break Sabbath laws? No, Jesus did not break the spirit of the Sabbath laws. He directed those who were lost in the letter of the law. And their performance in keeping the letter of the law, it couldn't save them. So how much more then could it save us? But at the cross of Jesus, Jesus himself went hungry so that we could be filled. His body was shriveled so that ours could be healed. So trust in him. Trust in him. I want to encourage you, if you'd like to learn more about what it looks like to put your trust in Jesus, or if you want to have a one-on-one conversation about it, just go to investigatejesus.com. There you can set up a free call, and I'd be more than happy to help you think through your decision to follow Jesus. I think it's going to be the best decision that you'll ever make, which is why I want to help you make an informed decision about Jesus. Until then, I'll look forward to seeing you in the next episode.